Welcome to British Focus, the channel where we dive into the most pressing issues shaping our nation and beyond. Today, we tackle a fundamental right that is under serious threat: our freedom of speech. The ability to express our thoughts, opinions, and concerns without fear of censorship or suppression is the foundation of any true democracy. Yet, in recent years, we've witnessed an alarming shift in how speech is being controlled, particularly on social media platforms. While the United States has seen significant resistance against these threats, with efforts to ensure that citizens are not silenced by big tech companies, government overreach, or media bias, the UK and Europe are only beginning to have these crucial conversations. The tide is turning, and the battle for free expression is more urgent than ever. Today, we'll be reacting to a key member of Donald Trump's team as they expose and challenge the state of free speech in the UK and across Europe. Their insights reveal the broader fight against growing censorship and why it is vital to push back. But before we get into it, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to British Focus for more content like this. Your support helps keep these important discussions alive.
I heard his speech, and you're talking about JD's speech, right?
Yes, sir.
I heard his speech, and he talked about freedom of speech, and I think it's true in Europe. They're losing their wonderful right of freedom of speech. I see it. I mean, I thought he made a very good speech, actually, a very brilliant speech. Yeah. Europe has to be careful. And he talked about immigration. And Europe has a big immigration problem. Just take a look at what's happened with crime. Take a look at what's happening in various parts of Europe. I thought his speech was very well received, actually. I've heard very good remarks.
Donald Trump has spoken out, and whether you love him or hate him, is raising a point that cannot be ignored. The issue of free speech in the UK and Europe is becoming more pressing by the day, and yet, our own leaders, particularly Keir Starmer, seem intent on pretending that everything is fine. But everything is not fine. The very foundation of democracy rests on the ability of citizens to express themselves freely, yet we are watching that right erode before our eyes. Trump pointed out something that should concern every single one of us: Europe is losing its right to free speech. And his right. We are at a point where people are afraid to voice their opinions for fear of backlash, censorship, or even legal repercussions. This isn't just about online platforms clamping down on offensive content. It's about a much deeper shift in how dissent is being handled. Starmer and his party have done nothing to stand up against this dangerous trend. Instead, they enable it. They pander to the woke mobs, they push for policies that restrict what people can and cannot say, and they prioritize political correctness over fundamental liberties. And for what? To appease a vocal minority that screams for suppression whenever they encounter a viewpoint they dislike? Look at the trajectory we're on. Trump is pointing out something that many of us have been saying for years. This isn't just happening in the United States. It's happening right here at home. The government is getting more comfortable with silencing people it disagrees with. Whether it's social media bans, police arresting citizens for thought crimes, or the press selectively choosing what narratives to push and what stories to bury, the result is the same: a nation where freedom of speech is conditional on whether it aligns with the mainstream narrative. And Keir Starmer? Silent. Absolutely silent. Because deep down, he doesn't care about defending your right to speak freely. He cares about controlling the conversation. And let's not forget the second point Trump made: immigration. The connection between mass migration and the erosion of free speech is something that too many politicians refuse to discuss. Trump called it out directly. Europe has a massive immigration problem. We see it in crime rates, we see it in the strain on public services. And yet, bringing up these concerns is met with accusations of bigotry. In Starmer's Britain, it's unacceptable to even question whether uncontrolled immigration is good for the country. Never mind the evidence. Never mind the countless stories of communities being overwhelmed. If you dare raise these concerns, you're immediately shut down. Trump said it outright: Europe needs to be careful. And he's not wrong. The question is, why are our own leaders unwilling to acknowledge the reality? Are they too afraid of being labeled as controversial? Or are they complicit in this dangerous game where censorship and mass migration go hand in hand to reshape our society in a way that benefits only the elite? The UK deserves better. We deserve leaders who will stand up for free speech, who will defend the right of the people to speak openly without fear of persecution, and who will acknowledge the very real consequences of uncontrolled migration. But instead, we have Keir Starmer, a man more concerned with towing the politically correct line than addressing the real issues facing this country. He won't stand up for your right to speak. He won't address the dangers of uncontrolled immigration. He won't fight for British values. So if our own leaders won't defend us, who will? Maybe it's time to stop waiting for them to wake up and start pushing back ourselves.
And unfortunately, when I look at Europe today, it's sometimes not so clear what happened to some of the Cold War's winners. I look to Brussels, where EU commissars warn citizens that they intend to shut down social media during times of civil unrest the moment they spot what they've judged to be, quote, hateful content. Or to this very country, where police have carried out raids against citizens suspected of posting anti-feminist comments online as part of, quote, combating misogyny on the internet, a day of action. I look to Sweden, where 2 weeks ago the government convicted a Christian activist for participating in Koran burnings that resulted in his friend's murder. And as the judge in his case chillingly noted, Sweden's laws to supposedly protect free expression do not, in fact, grant, and I'm quoting, a free pass to do or say anything without risking offending the group that holds that belief. And perhaps most concerningly, I look to our very dear friends, the United Kingdom, where the backslide away from conscience rights has placed the basic liberties of religious Britons in particular in the crosshairs. A little over 2 years ago, the British government charged Adam Smith Connor, a 51-year-old physiotherapist and an Army veteran, with the heinous crime of standing 50 meters from an abortion clinic and silently praying for 3 minutes. Not obstructing anyone, not interacting with anyone, just silently praying on his own. And after British law enforcement spotted him and demanded to know what he was praying for, Adam replied simply, it was on behalf of the unborn son he and his former girlfriend had aborted years before. Now, the officers were not moved. Adam was found guilty of breaking the government's new buffer zones law, which criminalizes silent prayer and other actions that could influence a person's decision within 200 meters of an abortion facility. He was sentenced to pay thousands of pounds in legal costs to the prosecution. Now, I wish I could say that this was a fluke, a one-off crazy example of a badly written law being enacted against a single person, but no. This last October, just a few months ago, the Scottish government began distributing letters to citizens whose houses lay within so-called safe access zones, warning them that even private prayer within their own homes may amount to breaking the law. Naturally, the government urged readers to report any fellow citizens suspected guilty of thought crime. In Britain and across Europe, free speech, I fear, is in retreat.
J.D. Vance has put into words what many of us have been thinking for years. Europe, and more specifically the UK, is slipping into a dangerous place where freedom of speech is no longer a right but a privilege granted by those in power. And let's be honest, the ones in power, people like Keir Starmer, have no intention of allowing true free expression. They hide behind buzzwords like combating hate speech or creating a safer society. But in reality, what they are doing is controlling what people can and cannot say. Just look at what's happening. Vance points to Brussels, where EU bureaucrats openly admit that they would shut down social media if they felt it was necessary. That's right, a complete blackout on communication platforms. Not because of criminal activity, not because of national security threats, but simply because they have decided that certain opinions are too hateful to exist. And who gets to decide what is hateful? Unelected officials who operate in the shadows, accountable to no one but themselves. This is the kind of authoritarian mindset that Britain is aligning itself with under the weak, directionless leadership of Starmer. But it's not just the EU, it's happening right here. We have police carrying out raids against people accused of posting anti-feminist comments online. Let that sink in. Not violent criminals, not fraudsters stealing from the hard-working taxpayer, not drug dealers peddling poison to our youth. No, our law enforcement is wasting time and resources on tracking down individuals who dared to say something that doesn't fit the politically correct narrative. This is Starmer's Britain. A country where saying the wrong thing is treated as a more serious offense than actual criminal behavior. And then there's Sweden, where a man was convicted simply for burning a book. It wasn't just that he was punished, it was why he was punished. The court made it explicitly clear that their laws do not protect free expression if that expression offends a certain group. This is the precedent being set across Europe, and we are seeing the same creeping authoritarianism in Britain. Free speech is no longer about the right to express your views. It's about whether those views align with the approved opinions of the establishment. And if they don't, you will be silenced. Perhaps most worrying of all is what's happening in our own country. The UK, once a beacon of democracy and individual liberty, is sliding into something unrecognizable. We now have buffer zones where people can be arrested for silently praying near an abortion clinic. Think about that for a moment. Someone standing still, thinking in their own head, is now a criminal act in this country. And Keir Starmer? Silent. Complicit. Of course, he is. His entire political career has been built on pandering to the very forces pushing this insanity. He won't stand up for your rights. He won't defend free speech. He is too afraid of offending the same radical ideologues who are dictating policy in the UK. And it doesn't stop there. In Scotland, the government has taken it a step further, sending letters to citizens warning them that even private prayer in their own homes could be illegal. Think about what that means. We are no longer just talking about censorship in the public sphere. We are talking about the government reaching into people's personal lives, into their private thoughts, and declaring certain beliefs unacceptable. This isn't just political overreach, this is the stuff of dystopian fiction. But under Starmer's leadership, don't expect any resistance. Expect compliance. Expect silence. Expect more restrictions. This is not the Britain that so many fought and died for. Free speech is not a luxury, it is a right. And yet, the establishment, aided by spineless politicians like Starmer, wants to chip away at it until nothing remains. If we don't stand up now, if we don't push back against this growing authoritarianism, there may come a day when expressing even the mildest criticism of the government is enough to land someone in legal trouble. The time to wake up is now. Because once we lose free speech, we lose everything.
I believe there is nothing more urgent than mass migration. Today, almost 1 in 5 people living in this country moved here from abroad. That is, of course, an all-time high. It's a similar number, by the way, in the United States, also an all-time high. The number of immigrants who entered the EU from non-EU countries doubled between 2021 and 2022 alone, and of course it's gotten much higher since. And we know this situation, it didn't materialize in a vacuum. It's the result of a series of conscious decisions made by politicians all over the continent and others across the world over the span of a decade. We saw the horrors wrought by these decisions yesterday in this very city. And of course, I can't bring it up again without thinking about the terrible victims who had a beautiful winter day in Munich ruined. Our thoughts and prayers are with them and will remain with them. But why did this happen in the first place? It's a terrible story, but it's one we've heard way too many times in Europe and unfortunately too many times in the United States as well. An asylum seeker, often a young man in his mid-20s, already known to police, rams a car into a crowd and shatters a community. How many times must we suffer these appalling setbacks before we change course and take our shared civilization in a new direction? No voter on this continent went to the ballot box to open the floodgates to millions of unvetted immigrants.
Mass migration is not just an issue, it is the issue, and yet our politicians refuse to confront it honestly. J.D. Vance is right when he says that Europe is facing an unprecedented crisis, and the UK is no exception. Almost 1 in 5 people living in this country today were born abroad, an all-time high. Yet if you dare to question the long-term consequences of this reality, you are immediately labeled as xenophobic or far-right. Why? Because the establishment, led by weak leaders like Keir Starmer, has no interest in acknowledging the real impact of their reckless immigration policies. Let's be clear, this situation didn't just happen overnight. It wasn't some inevitable demographic shift. It was the direct result of deliberate political choices made over the past decade. Choices that have put ideology above national security, above economic stability, and above the well-being of British citizens. The rapid influx of migrants from non-EU countries into Europe doubled between 2021 and 2022, and it has only escalated since. But rather than take a step back and reassess, our leaders are doubling down. Instead of controlling our borders, they are leaving them wide open, welcoming wave after wave of people without the slightest regard for whether our infrastructure, our public services, or our communities can sustain them. We have seen the consequences of these policies time and time again. Just recently, a city in Europe was rocked by yet another violent attack carried out by an asylum seeker. Another horrifying example of what happens when governments prioritize open borders over public safety. And yet, whenever a tragedy like this occurs, the response from the political class is always the same. Empty words, meaningless platitudes, and absolutely no action to prevent it from happening again. How many more innocent people need to suffer before we acknowledge that this approach has failed? And let's talk about the people committing these acts. Time and time again, we hear the same profile. A young man, usually in his 20s, often known to the police, frequently flagged as a potential threat, yet somehow still allowed to remain in the country. Why? Because politicians like Starmer refuse to take a hard stance. They refuse to acknowledge that not everyone arriving here is simply looking for a better life. Instead, they champion open borders under the guise of compassion while ignoring the devastating impact these policies are having on ordinary British citizens. And let's be honest, none of this was ever put to the people. No voter in this country ever chose to open the floodgates to millions of unvetted migrants. No one went to the ballot box and ticked a box for mass migration on an unprecedented scale. Instead, this was forced upon us by out-of-touch elites who are more concerned with looking good on the international stage than they are with protecting their own citizens. And what does Starmer do? He plays along. He refuses to confront the issue, he refuses to offer solutions, and worst of all, he refuses to listen to the very people he claims to represent. The reality is that Britain is at a crossroads. We either continue down this dangerous path, allowing our borders to remain open and our security to deteriorate, or we take a stand. We demand accountability from those who have created this mess. We push back against the narrative that questioning mass migration is somehow immoral. Because if we don't, if we continue to sit back and accept this as the new normal, then the Britain we know will cease to exist. The choice is ours, but time is running out.